Chapter 5, Mishnah 7. We learned in Mishnah 1 that it is forbidden to pay in advance for merchandise that will not be delivered until a later date, because its price might go up before it is delivered, and the buyer will end up getting more value than he paid for. This resembles interest on a loan because it looks like the seller is giving more in exchange for being allowed to use the money he was paid in advance. The rabbis therefore prohibited it. However, since the prohibition is only rabbinic, the rabbis included several leniencies in it. One of these leniencies is that it is permitted to pay in advance for merchandise the seller already has in his possession, even though the buyer will not receive it until sometime later. Our Mishnah discusses the law where the seller does not yet have the merchandise. We may not set a price and pay in advance for produce that the seller does not have now, until a market price for that type of produce becomes established. Before that time, the seller may not be able to buy the produce for the money he receives from the buyer, and he therefore cannot be viewed as having the produce. Once the market price becomes established, we can set a price and pay in advance, because even though this one, the seller, does not yet have that produce, that one, a different person, does have it. Since the seller can easily buy the produce at the going rate with the money he receives from the buyer, we consider it as if he already has the produce when the buyer pays him in advance. The law we just learned applies where the seller does not actually have the produce at the time he is paid in advance. If he does have it, the buyer can surely be viewed as acquiring it immediately, even if there is no established market price yet. The Mishnah now elaborates on the extent of this leniency. If the seller was the first of the harvesters to bring in his grain, and he already has a stack of it waiting to be processed, but there is not yet an established market price for it, a buyer may set a price and pay in advance for grain from that stack, even though that grain is not yet ready to be sold. Similarly, he may agree on a price and pay in advance for wine that will be made from a tub of grapes that the seller is preparing to press, and for oil that will be made from a vat of olives that the seller is preparing to press, and for earthenware vessels that will be made from the clay balls that a potter has, and for plaster once the materials for which it will be made has been put in the furnace. The Mishnah records three views with regarding to paying in advance for fertilizer when there is not yet an established market price for it. One may set a price and pay in advance for fertilizer all year round, that is, even during the winter. Although not everyone has it then, many people do. Thus, even if the seller does not have it, he can easily buy it from someone else at the price for which he is selling it to the buyer. The second view. Rabbi Yossi says one may not set a price and pay in advance for fertilizer unless the seller has fertilizer in his compost heap, even during the summer. The third view. The sages permit paying in advance even if the seller does not have fertilizer, but only during the summer when everyone has it and it can be bought anywhere. The Mishnah now returns to a case in which the seller does not have the produce, but it has an established market price. As we learned, a buyer can pay for the produce in advance and thus guarantee that he will not have to pay more for it later if the price goes up. The Mishnah discusses what happens if the buyer is concerned that the price will go down, and he will end up having paid too much for it. The buyer may agree to a price and pay in advance on condition that if the price for the produce goes down, the seller will give it to him for the better price. The previous ruling implies that if the buyer does not make this condition and the price goes down, the seller can give the buyer the produce at the original higher price. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees. Rabbi Yehuda says even if the buyer did not agree to a price and pay in advance for produce at the better price, i.e., even if he did not make this condition explicitly when he agreed to the original contract, if the price went down, the buyer can still say to him, "Give me the produce at this better lower price, or give me back my money." According to Rabbi Yehuda, every buyer intends this when he agrees to an advance contract, and it is therefore as if he made this condition explicitly.